Brandon Clarke, the Memphis Grizzlies forward, is dead at only 29 years old. But what most people missed is that just weeks before his death, Clarke had already made headlines for a serious arrest in Arkansas. And once you put that arrest next to what's now being reported about the investigation into his death, the final weeks of his life start looking a lot heavier. This is not a story where we jump to conclusions. The official cause of death has not been released. The autopsy still matters. The investigation still matters. But right now, people are trying to understand how a player who once looked like one of the Grizzlies' most reliable young pieces went from a promising NBA career to injuries, to legal trouble, and then to a sudden death that shocked the basketball world. Because at first, the headline sounded simple. NBA player dies at 29, but then the details started coming out. The location, the emergency response, the possible overdose investigation, the arrest weeks earlier, and that is when this stopped being just another sad sports headline. It became a timeline, and that timeline is what people are trying to piece together now. But before we get to the arrest, you have to understand what was confirmed first. Brandon Clarke was not retired. He was not some forgotten former player. He was still a Memphis Grizzlies player. He had been with that organization for years. And that is why the reaction from the NBA world came so fast. But what happened next raised even more questions. According to reports, Brandon Clarke died after emergency responders were called to a residence in the Los Angeles area. He was only 29. The Memphis Grizzlies, the NBA, and his representatives all confirmed the news, but the official cause of death was not immediately released. That part is important, because when a story like this breaks, people online immediately start filling in blanks. But the only responsible way to tell it is to separate what is confirmed from what is still being investigated. What is confirmed is that Clarke is gone. What is also being reported is that authorities are investigating the death as a possible overdose. Reports also say items connected to substance use were found at the scene. But again, the final medical answer comes from the autopsy. That is the line. That is the difference between reporting and guessing. Still, the reason this story is getting so much attention is because this did not happen in isolation. Just weeks before his death, Brandon Clarke had been arrested. And once that detail came back into the conversation, people started asking a different question. Was the arrest just a separate incident, or was it part of a bigger warning sign that something was wrong behind the scenes? That is where this story gets complicated, because when fans think of NBA players, they think of money, trainers, team doctors, private flights, security, and access to the best help possible. But none of that automatically protects somebody from pressure. None of that automatically protects somebody from pain, and none of that automatically tells the public what a person is dealing with when the cameras are off. And in Brandon Clarke's case, the cameras had already been off a lot lately because injuries had changed everything. But before the injury part, we have to talk about the arrest that happened weeks before his death. The detail that changed the whole conversation was the April arrest. Reports say Brandon Clarke was arrested in Arkansas by the Cross County Sheriff's Office, and the charges being reported were not just one minor issue. They included improper passing, possession of a controlled substance, trafficking a controlled substance, fleeing in a vehicle, and speeding. That is the part that made people stop, because when you hear an NBA player got arrested, you might assume it was something small, a misunderstanding, a traffic issue, something that would blow over, but the reported charges made this feel more serious. And when that arrest happens only weeks before a sudden death, people are naturally going to revisit it. Now, to be clear, an arrest is not a conviction. Charges are allegations unless proven in court, and nobody should pretend that the arrest automatically explains what happened later. But it is part of the public timeline now. And the timing is impossible to ignore, because Brandon Clarke was not just dealing with legal trouble, he was also dealing with a career that had been interrupted over and over again. And that combination, injury, time away from the game, public embarrassment, legal stress, and then a sudden death, is why people are looking at the final stretch of his life with a different kind of sadness. It was not just that he passed away young. It was that the week before his death already showed signs that something was off. And that is where the story turns from sports news into something more human. Because sometimes the public only sees the player, the jersey, the stats, the contract, the highlights. But when a person disappears from the court, gets caught up in trouble, and then suddenly passes away, it forces everybody to ask what was happening when nobody was watching. And for Brandon Clarke, There was another layer that made this even harder. He was not playing much. He was hurt. He was away from the normal rhythm of the NBA, and that matters more than people realize. Brandon Clarke's final NBA years were not smooth. At one point, he looked like one of the most valuable role players in Memphis. He was athletic, efficient, tough around the rim, the kind of player who did not need the ball every possession to affect the game. But injuries started taking pieces away from his career. He suffered a major Achilles injury in 2023. Then he had more setbacks. Then more time away. And during the 2025 to 26 season, reports say he only appeared in 2 games. That is a major detail, because when an athlete is playing every night, their life has structure, practice, games, travel, film, treatment, teammates, routine. But when the injuries stack up, the routine changes. The player still has money. The player still has a name, but the identity can start shifting. One day, you are part of the rotation. Then suddenly, you are rehabbing, watching, waiting, trying to get back. And every setback feels heavier because the league keeps moving without you. That does not mean we know what Brandon Clarke was feeling. We do not. But we do know he had been dealing with major physical setbacks. We do know his career has slowed down. We do know he was away from the court far more than he wanted to be. And we do know that weeks before his death, he ended up in a serious legal situation. That is why this timeline is so troubling. It is not one detail by itself. It is the combination, the injury, the absence, the arrest, the sudden death, and the unanswered questions. But to understand why people are reacting the way they are, you also have to understand who Brandon Clarke was before these final headlines. Because for a lot of Memphis fans, this was not just some player on the roster, this was BC, and that name meant something. Before the sad news, before the arrest reports, before the speculation, Brandon Clarke had built a real name in basketball. He played college ball at San Jose State and Gonzaga. At Gonzaga, he turned into a serious NBA prospect. Then in 2019, he was drafted in the first round and ended up with the Memphis Grizzlies. And he fit that Memphis team perfectly. Not flashy in the way Ja Morant was flashy. Not loud, not always the headline, but reliable, efficient, high energy. A player who could come in, finish around the rim, defend, rebound, and give the team minutes that actually mattered. His rookie season was strong enough for him to make the all-rookie first team. And in Memphis, fans respected him because he felt like one of those players who just worked. No extra drama, no constant spotlight, just production. That is why this news hit people so strangely, because when a player has a reputation as calm, friendly, and dependable, it becomes hard for fans to process when his name suddenly appears next to an arrest report and then a death investigation. That contrast is what makes the story feel so unsettling. On one side, you have the Brandon Clarke fans remembered, the teammate, the role player, the Grizzlies piece, the guy people described with warmth. On the other side, you have the final weeks, the charges, the unanswered questions, the emergency response, the investigation. And right in the middle is a family, a locker room, and a fan base trying to make sense of a loss that came way too early. And that is why the reactions were not just about basketball, they were about disbelief. Because nobody expected this story to end here. After the news came out, the reaction moved fast. The Grizzlies mourned him. The NBA acknowledged the loss. His representatives remembered him as someone loved by the people around him, and fans online were stunned because this did not feel real. For Memphis fans, Brandon Clarke was one of the players connected to an era of hope. That Grizzlies team had energy, they had young stars, they had personality, they had the feeling of a team rising, and Clarke was part of that. He was not always the face of the franchise, but he was part of the foundation. That is why his death at 29 feels so abrupt, because 29 is not old in life. And in sports, 29 is usually when people are still talking about what a player can become after injuries, not how they will be remembered after death. But now the conversation has shifted. People are not just talking about his numbers. They are talking about what signs may have been missed. They are talking about how fast things can change. They are talking about how a player can be surrounded by the NBA machine and still be fighting things the public does not fully understand. And that is the part that gives this story weight. Because if the official investigation confirms what is being looked at, then this becomes bigger than basketball. It becomes a conversation about injuries, isolation, pressure, access, and the people around athletes when their careers stop feeling normal. But until the final report comes out, There is still a line that cannot be crossed. You can ask questions, you can follow the timeline, you can report what is being investigated, but you cannot declare the final answer before the medical examiner does. And that is where the story stands right now. A confirmed death, a reported investigation, a recent arrest, and a lot of unanswered questions. The next major answer will come from the official investigation. The autopsy matters, the toxicology results matter, the final cause and manner of death matter. Because right now, there are two stories happening at the same time. One is the human story. A 29-year-old man is gone. His family is grieving. His teammates are grieving. Fans are trying to process it. The other is the public timeline. An NBA player was injured. He barely played this season. He was arrested weeks before his death. Then he died suddenly in California. And that is why this story still feels unfinished. Not because people need to speculate, but because the confirmed facts already raise enough questions on their own. What happened in those final weeks? Was the arrest a warning sign? Were people around him aware of how serious things might have been? And when the official report comes back, will it make the timeline clearer? Or will it raise even more questions? That is the part everybody is waiting on now. Because Brandon Clarke's story should have been about a comeback. It should have been about getting healthy, getting back on the court, finding his role again. Instead, the final chapter is now being told through statements, reports, and an investigation. And that is what makes this one hit different. Now, the biggest question is what happens next, because this story still doesn't feel finished. If you want the next chapter, when it drops, subscribe.